A warm welcome to you all to today's webinar. My name is Grace Nicolette, and I'm Vice President of Programming and External Relations at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. The theme for today's discussion is Much Alarm, Less Action, Foundations and Climate Change, and we're so glad you've joined us. First, for those of you tuning in who are new to CEP, I'd love to share a bit about ourselves. Our work is focused on philanthropic effectiveness. For 2 decades now, we've sought to help foundations and increasingly individual donors to improve their effectiveness and increase their impact. We do this through assessments and research reports that often lift up the perspective of those who wouldn't otherwise be heard, as well as programs like this one. We're a nonprofit and rely on grants and contributions to support our research and programs, so please reach out if you're interested in supporting us. Our calendar for opting into a round of grantee, donor, or staff surveys is filling up, so please reach out if you work at a foundation and would like to learn more about our assessments, especially as you plan for next year. We've been holding a series of virtual gatherings this year on topics related to philanthropic effectiveness, with 2 more events scheduled for this fall, so we hope you'll keep an eye out as our dates are announced via our email communications. I also want to say a special thanks to our event sponsors, our premier sponsor, the Walton Family Foundation, and our sponsors, Archstone Foundation, the Jacob and Valeria Langloff Foundation, and New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, as well as a special thank you to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for funding this report. Next, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with everyone. First, we're in a webinar format, which means all of you are muted and have your videos off upon entering the session. If you have questions for the panelists during today's presentation, and we hope you do, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel, and we'll try to be as responsive as we can during the Q&A portion of the webinar. We will not be using the hand-raising function of the webinar, as we're not asking attendees to speak their questions. If you require technical assistance, please reach out to my colleague, Say Darling, at saed@cep.org, and he can assist you. We'll also be sharing some resources with you via the chat box, so feel free to check there for helpful links and resources. And if you're on Twitter today, you can also join the conversation there using the hashtag #MuchAlarmLessAction. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll send a link to all registrants in a follow-up email. That follow-up email will also list the links to the resources that you'll hear about today. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, I have the privilege of introducing our speakers and panelists for today. First, my colleagues Naomi Orenstein and Katarina Malmgren will be sharing a brief overview of the report's findings. They are 2 of the authors of the report. Naomi is now the Senior Director of Programs and Strategy at the Duro Foundation. Naomi has also graciously stepped in to be our moderator after Crystal Haling shared that she wasn't able to moderate the session this week, so you'll notice that change in the program. Thank you, Naomi. And next, I wanted to introduce our panelists, Colette Pichon-Battle, Co-Executive Director of Taproot Earth, formerly known as the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, Kara Ane Carlisle, Vice President of Programs at the McKnight Foundation, and Taryn Higashi, Executive Director of Unbound Philanthropy. We're so grateful to all of you for joining us today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Naomi and Katarina.
Thank you, Grace. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm really excited to have a rich discussion and to learn from our awesome panelists today. And I'm excited now to dig in and share the key findings and highlights from this research study. Across the globe, many people are already experiencing the negative effects of climate change in the form of extreme weather, including more frequent and more intense heat waves, wildfires, hurricanes, and droughts. Additionally, climate change already is having and will continue to have significant and interconnected negative effects on every aspect of our society, our politics, and our economy. This is particularly the case for the world's poorest people and countries who have done the least to contribute to climate change. And here in the United States, climate change disproportionately affects historically marginalized communities. Scientists have long been ringing the alarm bell with alarming evidence that tipping points have already been reached and the window for action is narrowing. Yet, despite the urgency of this issue, attention to and funding for climate change remains limited. Given this, we at CEP are grateful to funding from the Hewlett Foundation, and specifically for the study, we sought to answer these questions. How pressing of a problem is climate change in the eyes of foundation and nonprofit leaders? And how do they think climate change will affect their work? We also sought to answer, what are nonprofit and foundation leaders doing to address climate change? And among organizations not focused on climate, how are they thinking about this issue? Finally, how are climate-focused organizations approaching their work? So to answer these questions, we surveyed leaders of US-based foundations and US-based nonprofit last winter. We ultimately received 188 responses from foundation leaders and 120 responses from nonprofit leaders. So across both of those surveys, we achieved a 24% response rate. I want to touch on some methodology here for a moment. So when Katarina and I are sharing this data, we're going to be talking about funders that do and don't address climate change. And I want to unpack what we mean by that, because there's numerous ways that we could categorize funding for climate change. Some take a more narrow definition and only consider funding to climate mitigation, adaptation, and climate justice. And others take a broader view and consider environmental efforts and funding to that work, whether conservation, ecosystems, or sustainable development, and consider that as ultimately addressing climate change. So with a lot of input, we ultimately landed on using a broad approach. So when Katarina and I are talking about climate funders, what we mean is that we're talking about foundation leaders and nonprofit leaders who indicated in their survey responses that they either explicitly fund climate change or they fund environmental efforts that ultimately address climate change. I also want to touch on response bias. As we fielded these surveys, we tried really hard to make sure that we heard perspectives from all types of funders and nonprofit leaders, including those that do and do not work in the climate space. It may be the case that leaders who are more concerned about climate change were more likely to respond to our survey, but we did get a really good mix of responses. As you can see here on the slide, among foundation leaders responding to our survey, 61% told us that they fund efforts to address climate change. And among nonprofit leaders responding to our survey, 25% told us that climate change is a core focus of their work. Okay, so with that methodology and context about our sample, let's turn to the first finding. And that is, foundation and nonprofit leaders overwhelmingly see climate change as an urgent problem that will negatively impact the lives of the people served by their organizations, especially historically marginalized communities. While they believe the public and private sectors in particular are not doing enough to address climate change, they believe foundations and nonprofits could also be doing more. So digging in, as you can see here in this chart, relative to other problems facing society, most leaders told us that climate change is one of the top 3 most important problems to address right now. Foundation and nonprofit leaders believe that climate change will negatively affect many aspects of their work, including the lives of the people they serve, the geographies they work in, the issues that they work on, and ultimately their own ability to achieve their goals. Leaders talked about this in their responses to the open-ended survey questions. As one said, if we do not bring climate change under control, our efforts will be undone by the cascading economic and social effects of climate change. Another leader added, our priorities, the advancement of social justice and racial equity will be dramatically affected by climate change because low wealth communities and people of color will bear the brunt of the negative impacts. So, whose role is it to address climate change? As you can see here on the slide, foundation leaders say that all sectors, public sector, private sector, and the nonprofit sector all play a role in addressing climate change. And they also say that no sector is doing enough to address this challenge. Leaders, as you can see here, see the public and private sectors as playing a more significant role than nonprofits and foundations. However, and really important, virtually all foundation leaders underscored the important role that philanthropy can play. They say that philanthropy can play a meaningful, unique role in addressing climate change. As one, the leaders talked about how foundations can take risks, how they can use their voice, use their resources, how they can convene and collaborate. As one said, philanthropy can and should be a first mover that sets a good example for others to follow, that can influence public policy and businesses to do the right thing. All right, Katerina, I'm going to turn it over to you to walk us through the rest of the data.
Thanks, Naomi. I'm now going to talk about our second key finding, which states that despite foundation leaders' concerns about climate change, foundation efforts to address climate change are relatively limited in terms of grant dollars and investment practices, and are also seen as limited in effectiveness. Foundation and nonprofit leaders alike describe ample opportunity for philanthropy to engage more deeply and effectively to combat climate change. So first, let's talk about US foundation funding of climate change. Among the funders in our sample already engaged in this space, these efforts tend to be a relatively small proportion of total giving. As you can see here in the first two bars, the majority of climate foundation leaders said that their climate funding is less than 20% of their total grant dollars for the current fiscal year. When it comes to financial investment practices, climate-related action among the foundations in our sample is similarly limited. Among all foundations in our sample, 31% said that they engage in climate-related impact investing, and 22% said that their foundation prohibits investments in fossil fuels or other carbon emitters from their investment portfolios. Yet among these funders who have divested, none reported that their returns have underperformed benchmarks that include fossil fuels since they made the move to divest. And among the majority of leaders in our sample who do not engage in climate-related investment practices, we observed some openness about whether they would do so in the future. The funders already engaged in these practices shared advice for those who are open to changing their investment practices. Some noted that there's no longer a financial trade-off for strategic and thoughtful investors and described this as both a financial and a mission win. Others urged funders to be braver leaders on divestment. In our survey, we asked foundations that are engaged in climate change efforts for more specifics about their approach to this work. Among those explicitly fund climate change, about 80% said that they fund mitigation efforts, 70% said that they fund adaptation, and 65% said that they fund climate justice. More than 40% said that they fund in all three of these approaches. Looking a bit further at how climate funders do their work, 96% said that collaboration with others is a part of their foundation strategy. 64% said that their climate-related efforts prioritize funding the communities most impacted by climate change. Slightly fewer, 55%, said that they prioritize funding organizations led by the people and communities who are most impacted by climate change. And 54% said that influencing public policy is a part of their foundation strategy to address climate change. Importantly, we found some differences in foundation strategies when we analyzed these responses by whether the foundation CEO identifies as a person of color. Foundations whose leaders identify as people of color were more likely to fund climate justice efforts. They were more likely to say they prioritize funding for the communities most impacted by climate change. And they were also more likely to say they prioritize funding organizations led by the people and communities most affected by climate change. And when it comes to how they approach their policy work, they more frequently said that they support movement building and using the foundation's voice, for example, through position papers or public statements. So now that we have a bit of a sense of the approaches of climate funders in this study, let's talk about perceptions of effectiveness. While assessing the effectiveness of anything foundations do is challenging, and maybe particularly so given the scale and the scope of the climate change problem, climate foundation and nonprofit leaders alike think that foundation efforts to address climate change have not been particularly effective. As you see here in the dark blue in this chart, only 11% of foundation leaders rated their own foundation strategy for addressing climate change as very effective, and even fewer, 4%, said that efforts by philanthropic foundations broadly to address climate change are very effective. A majority of climate leaders said that their own foundation strategy and efforts by foundations broadly have been somewhat effective, as you can see represented in the orange or in the yellow bar in the middle of this chart. So what would it take for climate philanthropy to be more effective? Leaders of climate foundations and climate nonprofits have a lot to say about this. First, they underscore the need for more focus on and more funding for climate change. Additionally, about 60% of foundation leaders said funders should do more advocacy through their grant making and through the use of their voice. They suggest more public policy engagement and more support for organizing. As one leader said, the scope of the challenge exceeds the power of the programmatic grant. The work needs to be public policy focused. Another added, funders can help build political and community will. Leaders of climate organizations also urged funders to take more collective action, to collaborate more and better. One said, all of us on the funding side need to coalesce around this issue for it to have traction. Finally, leaders also emphasized climate justice. As one said, to save all of us, we need to ensure that those among us who are most vulnerable and those who have been most historically excluded from prosperity be included and uplifted in a new vision for a post-carbon world. Lastly, I want to turn to talk about our third key finding. Despite their concerns about climate change, most non-climate funders tend to see this issue as outside the scope of their mission, though some have not ruled out future funding efforts to address climate change. Leaders of climate nonprofits and foundations urge these funders to consider how climate change affects their missions. So even as these leaders of non-climate foundations report seeing climate change as an urgent problem and believe that it will ultimately create more extreme conditions that affect their fields and their communities, they most frequently said that the reason they do not fund efforts to address climate change is that it's not a part of their mission. Comments from some of these leaders suggested that climate change may be experienced as abstract or far off. Among other top reasons funders say they do not fund climate change, 39% said that the board has limited interest in or willingness to address climate change. And 35% said that the problem is too big relative to their foundation's resources or geographic area of focus. This study did surface some openness to addressing climate change from those not currently engaged in this work. 45% of foundation leaders have not closed the door on the possibility of funding climate change. These leaders said that they want to better understand the connection between climate change and their areas of focus. They expressed interest in more information, including opportunities to learn from other funders and help for building board support. I'd like help mapping our existing mission to climate change, said one leader. Another said, give us the language and the strategy to correlate climate change with enhancing lives for all who live in our community, and my board would probably support climate change initiatives. Indeed, considering the impacts of climate change on foundations' work is exactly what leaders of climate foundations most frequently encourage more non-climate funders to do. Noting that climate change is an everything issue, climate funders suggested that others consider the intersections of climate with their impact goals. These funders encourage non-climate funders to learn from and partner with others and start somewhere, even if it's small. Another said, climate change exacerbates inequities, undermines economic well-being, and creates a bigger gap between those who are thriving and those who are not. From small to big things, climate change is an existential threat to all of our missions. And in the report, we include links to many resources about the intersections of climate with different issue areas for those who are interested in learning more. In conclusion, we hope this analysis of hundreds of foundation and nonprofit leaders' views can spur foundation staff, leaders, and boards to candidly discuss climate change and its implications on the people, communities, and issues that funders and nonprofits focus on. The stakes for our communities are high, but as one leader said, the problem can seem overwhelming, but there are steps we can all take, no matter our perspective. I'm now going to turn it back over to Naomi and the rest of our panel.
Thank you, Katerina, for walking us through all of this data. I'm going to ask our panelists, Kara, Taryn, and Colette, to thank you for coming back on screen. A quick reminder to folks, we're going to leave time for Q&A, but we really want to be responsive to what's on your mind. So don't be shy, put your questions in the chat. There's a lot to unpack here. And so Kara, Taryn, Colette, we are thrilled to be able to listen to you, to learn from you, to have a conversation with you all. In a minute, I'm going to ask each of you to share with all of our attendees a bit more about why you do this work and how you do this work. But first, really quick, like lightning round, what struck you most about the findings in this report and why? Colette, you want to take this one first?
Of course. Well, thank you so much, Naomi, and the CEP folks. It's great to call in from Choctaw Territory today in Louisiana. This report was really great for me. I've been a part of many efforts really looking at philanthropy and climate, but I really appreciated the cross-section here. Many things stood out for me. The part where folks don't see this as part of their mission. That's a reality we see on the ground a lot. People really are struggling to understand climate change. If you're not in one of these frontline zones, it could be hard. But I think the thing that stands out most for me was a little later in the report around climate-related financial investments and how the foundations in particular are not addressing the climate crisis through their own investment portfolios. It's a big call from the ground to have our allies and people who stand with us to take their money out of things that are harming us and harming the planet and accelerating the crisis. So that's really one thing that stands out for me. I see room for big movement and big improvement there.
This is great. And it is something that we're going to be digging more into, both this disconnect and investment practices. Taryn, what's your main takeaway?
It's also the disconnect. It really struck me how many non-climate funders see climate change as an urgent problem, but outside of the scope of their mission and resources. And yet they haven't ruled out future efforts to address it. So this is an opening. As the report points out, there are ample tools and lessons and on-ramps to help these funders include climate in their philanthropic programs, and to see that inclusion of climate brings them into the future and can make their contributions and impact even stronger. Our foundation is one of those foundations that's on a learning journey of integrating climate justice into our immigrant justice work. So I'm excited to share what we've been learning and to learn from others today.
Can't wait. Kara, your lightning round takeaway.
Sure, so I'll say two things that, so not to repeat, but to plus one, both thank you to CEP and the staff, and also appreciate the opportunity space that this opens up. And the two things I'll say is that I feel like we have a collective understanding and agreement, which is great because it is an uncontested scientific space, right? It is not a scientific question. So I think that stands out and is reflected in the levels of importance and understanding at that level. So I think that's a real opportunity, as Taryn said. The second piece is that I feel like our story collectively on multiple levels, as we think about this time of transition and transformation, is written in 100 different languages. So our social sector, because most of us, I think, on this call are working in philanthropy, many of us in this space from that perspective, I feel like we have a language problem, and our story isn't quite articulated in a way that we can see ourselves in the solutions, even though my sense is, based on even how you set up the study and how people think about climate, I think that there's an opportunity for us to think about deeper discussion around how do we want to co-design and evolve, because we must.
This is great. We're going to be unpacking all of this as best as we can in the next, 50 minutes. I want to turn now to this really crucial question: why and how you all do this work. Taryn, I want to start with you. Unbound isn't a traditional climate funder. Your focus is on a more welcoming society and a more just immigration system. Yet you've been exploring the intersection of climate and migration. In fact, you put out a really powerful report about this about a year ago. Will you tell us more about the evolution of this work and how you're thinking about it now?
Thank you for the question. For Unbound, given our mission, it's just not possible to see climate change outside of it, because the climate emergency is a key driver of internal and cross-border migration. It will put increasing pressure on an already inadequate immigration system that is clearly not prepared to handle future levels of migration. Unbound and our partners see immigration as a natural adaptation to the climate crisis. However, not everyone does. Some of the wealthiest countries have put up what Bill McKibben calls, quote, a global climate wall consisting of weapons, walls, spying systems, and prisons that aims to seal off the most powerful countries from the impacts of displacement, end quote. And this is being done at the expense of investing in climate finance for the world's poorest countries, investments that could address causes of displacement. So to change this, we need a new narrative about climate change and migration. And as Colette has said, we must establish a new social attitude to see migration as a public benefit, a nature-wide necessity for our global survival, not as a threat to our individual privilege. So Unbound did publish that report last December on the intersection of migration and climate change, and it addressed the necessity of safe and legal pathways for climate displaced people. It emphasized the benefits of seeing migration as adaptation and planning for it. It highlighted the need to transform the security threat narratives around migration. And our report also looked at how climate change is impacting immigrant communities already living and working in the US, at the protections that are required and the opportunities for workers and communities for building resilience. It highlighted many immigrants who are part of coalitions working on the intersection of climate and immigrant justice, racial justice, and economic justice. We followed up our report by publishing, in partnership with the Solutions Project, studies showcasing 5 of their grantees who are, including Colette's organization, extraordinary change makers and innovators and solutionaries from immigrant and other directly impacted communities. And we've begun making seed investments into the migrant and climate justice ecosystem and collaborating with like-minded funders. We're publishing more case studies on organizations organizing at the intersection of climate and migrant justice. And next week, we're hosting what we hope will be the first in a series of workshops for funders who are or are about to be investing at the intersection of climate and migrant justice to discuss opportunities for us to work and learn together.
Thank you so much for this, Taryn. I think it's really helpful to hear, and I'm sure for many that are listening in, about the evolution of this work and how you're approaching it with intersectionality in mind. That quote, migration as a public benefit, Colette, that's sticking with me. I want to turn now to you, Kara. McKnight has been funding in the environment for decades. Will you talk to us about the evolution of this work, particularly in a place-based family foundation context?
Great. So thank you. You know, McKnight, for many of you may know, has been a long-time funder in the climate space. We started funding in the mid-90s, really. That was around the time the first wind farm was built on the Buffalo Ridge in Minnesota. And I think that what's important about a family foundation, a place-based foundation, is that on the family side, there was a really deep curiosity and passion that really has been driven generationally from the family. The McKnight funds really come from 3M. And so there's been a DNA in the family and in the institution around innovation, around commitment to place, and a real commitment to people. And so and science has been at the root of how we think about change. And so here in Minnesota, fast forward from the mid-90s, where you begin to see these abstract ideas that you were saying before at the beginning are really coming to life in a place where you can touch it, you can feel it, you can see it. And so I think that really gives a unique point of view to a family foundation that has a generational commitment to a place. And so the second piece that I would say, fast forward, we now know, and our data and understanding of carbon emissions are very, very much more sophisticated. If you were to think about the upper Midwest, if you think about the economies of fossil fuel driven economies in the upper Midwest, you think about all the states, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, the Dakotas, certainly Wisconsin and Minnesota, can continue to push that out. we as a collective, if you were to look at us as a country, pull the Midwest out as a country, we're the 5th largest emitter of carbon pollution in the world. So one of our partners at the Energy Foundation oftentimes says to us, if we're able to not meet our carbon emission targets in the Midwest, we're going to not make our carbon emission reduction goals for the US. And as one of the largest emitters, we're not going to actually be able to get to where we need to as a planet. And so I think the depth of relationships, the understanding and the love of the people here who represent a lot of different perspectives and experiences really helps to position us well. And we do a lot of work in the Upper Midwest with other family foundations who also have a similar commitment to people and place, and that can actually connect some of these abstract ideas into a community and really begin to problem solve and think about solutions together. So really excited to be able to do the both and policy, people, place.
Both and, right? And, for folks that are listening in, I think that Kara's point about the Upper Midwest being, the 5th largest global emitter is a really important point for folks that are looking for an entry point, a starting point, and wondering how to do that in a local or regional context. Colette, we're coming over to you now. Talk to us about your work as a nonprofit leader and a climate justice advocate, and your work at Taproot Earth. How do you do this work? Why do you do this work? Unpack it a little bit for us.
Yeah, we've just shifted our name to Taproot Earth this month. We started out in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina as the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, and that work, I really like what Kara just mentioned around the McKnight family and their generational commitment to place. It was that generational commitment to place that brought me home from working in corporate law in the DC area. And I was actually working in corporate immigration, which brings me to Taryn's points around migration. What a strange combination of things to have on my shoulders, and knowledge of not just immigration law at the sort of family level, but an understanding of immigration law at the business level. And then to see Hurricane Katrina, to watch the impact, watch the US response and cleanup, the use of immigrant labor, the use of business immigration, but also looking at what Taryn said was the internal cross-border migration. Because what I was watching was a lot of poor and Black people from South Louisiana, South Mississippi being forced out. And I was watching a lot of brown folks from South America in particular being formally brought in, not illegally, not unlawfully, being brought in by some of the largest government contractors that are out there that we usually see rebuilding after war. And so you start putting these things together and you realize how much business, how much money, how little humanity is in recovery. And then 5 years after Katrina, we all remember the BP oil drilling disaster, where our legal organization was able to recover over $1 million just by signing our names to say that folks had legal representation. To watch what our country and what private industry did if people didn't have a lawyer looking over their shoulders to say they deserve this recovery was amazing to me. Because in both Katrina and BP, I assumed that our country was going to do the best that it could, that everyone had our interest at heart, only to find that what was really driving most of all of this, disaster recovery from hurricanes, disaster recovery from oil and gas disasters, was profit. And the profit margin and the profit incentive has really dehumanized what is really, I think, the biggest opportunity for the Gulf South and the US to really take a lead. I think my work has really been to connect a lot of dots. We started talking about climate and migration and immigration in 2006, and people thought we were crazy. They couldn't believe that we were trying to connect climate and immigration, and we were seeing it before our eyes. We also started connecting democracy, including census counts and all of these other things that would affect your political reality. They called us crazy. And now we're starting to see the impacts of mass migration and displacement, what it means to lose representation. Louisiana has lost a number of representatives in the US House because of this outward migration. And to think that folks haven't begun to put these things together. I asked my friend just the other day, what is the problem? And she said, you know, she realized that what it's going to take is for the dams to break. And I said, well, that's what it took down here. And I'm not even sure that that was enough to get people to understand that this is not a conversation about reducing carbon emissions. This is not a conversation about reducing the invisible thing for a future we don't know. This is a conversation that is really about how our past has led us to this present, and how this present is not ready for a future that is inclusive of massive change throughout not just our atmosphere, but our social and economic realities. So this has been my work, to pull in the front lines into this conversation so that we don't have what we've always had, which is a lot of scientists and well-meaning people trying to make decisions that trickle down to the folks who don't have opportunities. Instead, my job is to build power from the ground up, to make sure that those voices are part of all of the solutions, and to make sure that if we're having a conversation about survival, we listen to those communities that have actually survived some of the most horrendous realities of this country and this globe. And that's who we're going to need to count on to go forward.
Well, I'm grateful to you, Colette, for connecting these dots, right? This is our panelists here have just made a very clear case, and we're going to keep with this, but about the intersection of climate with racial justice, with democracy, with labor, with a fair economy, with migration, with health, et cetera. It goes on and on. So for folks who are on, are in this webinar wondering about how to make the connection between your mission and climate change, I think you've got a number of points here. We're going to keep connecting the dots. And specifically, I want to turn now to some of the disconnects that come through in this report. Those, all three of you, Colette, Taryn, and Kara, you highlighted this in your opening takeaways. Foundation leaders say that climate change is an extremely urgent problem. They say that it will negatively affect all aspects of their work. They say there's a really important role for philanthropy, and yet among these foundation leaders that don't consider themselves climate funders, the reasons why they tend not to fund in climate are primarily because they say it's outside their mission. And a good chunk are saying that it's just too big of a problem relative to their resources or to their geographic areas of focus. So I want to start here with the funder perspective. Taryn, let's kick this over to you. If a non-climate funder came to you and asked for your advice about how to connect their work to climate, what would you say? What advice would you give?
I mean, it's been said, but I will say it again. It's that climate change affects everyone. It's a threat multiplier. And as is almost always the case, the damage is compounded for communities that are already vulnerable to restrictive immigration policies, to patriarchal systems, to systemic racism, to economic stress and exploitation. And I'd encourage the funder to ask their grantees how climate change is intersecting with their work. When we do that, we're hearing about a lot of work that we didn't know about because we weren't asking about it before. And I'd argue that there are really few non-climate funders at the end of the day. If you convene your stakeholders on a regular basis, you share your analysis about the intersection of climate change with the issues that you're focused on, you're going to find yourself, like we have, inevitably integrating climate considerations into the way you look at the future. And I think funders have the ability to support making connections, connecting the dots, to support people to do that. And I think that that is, such a valuable asset that we can bring to this, giving space to people like Colette to make the connections and to share what they're learning. And for us, we're trying to share what we're learning by writing all of these reports and participating in all of these conversations. In the end, we can only solve these interconnected problems if we do it together.
Thank you, Taryn. I really appreciate that you just underline the importance too of listening to communities, listening to grantees, and learning and acting on that. Unique just to good climate philanthropy, but rather to effective philanthropy broadly. Kara, at McKnight, in addition to your climate work, you also you have a democracy program area, and there's some real intersection between your democracy and climate work. Will you Will you talk a little bit more about that and how you make the connection between democracy and climate in your giving?
Sure, and I'll start by saying that this is a brand new explicit funding area that the board adopted just in our most recent strategic framework. And so I think that the challenge had been similar maybe to the inverse of the way that we think about climate. There really wasn't a real deep investment in infrastructure around what we see now. Many funders, I would say, are also funding democracy, whether they call it that or not. And so I think where we began to see, we had done a lot of investment, particularly in the energy sector, and saw a lot of progress in the science and the technology and the technical aspect of the work. But where we started to get into trouble, and this is all over the Midwest, is that number one, it didn't translate well, right? Like folks that to this whole conversation, because it actually has been a scientific diagnosis. It's a very difficult work and it's very complicated work, and it takes a certain level of analysis and tools that I just want to honor that it's really tough to even understand this. And so I think that there has been a real important part of developing that, and that depth of engagement though is really hard to translate to the masses, right? And so what we began to say is, even though I would say Colette and Taryn and I, we just met, probably would all agree that all of the communities that we are part of and care about understand at different levels bad health air quality, really horrible pollutants, oil refineries, right? We see the dangers firsthand in terms of coal, and we also know that those are the drivers of economy and those are identity. Those transitions of economics are real people who have generational pride in providing for their families, right? So this is like our whole way of life transition. And so what we felt like, okay, now and this is, speaking for myself, I feel like we have the science, we have the data. What we don't have is an understanding, how do you cross-pollinate? And how do you begin to think more deeply about who we are, where we all need to feel like we have power to be part of the solution, and that where we are situated today doesn't ignore how we got here, but it also helps us create this momentum where you can hopefully have the synergy of saying, let's not pretend like, to the way that Colette, you started, acknowledging the movements of people, ownership, control, all these things that we wrestle with, economic models, things that we're romantically drawn to, like, Carburation Day, at the 500 track, like these are part of who we are, but we haven't quite been able to birth and even imagine like what we must be, and that we must be doing it together. And so we're still stuck a little bit in not enough at the balcony to see these. And I'm going to say something that is a little bit, hopefully it fits in with folks, but it struck me a long time ago, and it's being captured here quite well. Daniel Kahneman is like one of my favorite thinkers. He did Thinking Fast and Slow years ago, but he's talked extensively about the challenges around climate change, and he says three things. And he, of course, believes in science and believes in climate change. He says, one, the challenge for us this conversation is encapsulated here. It lacks salience, right? It's like climate change, right? It feels so ominous, and it's like distant, it's abstract. The way we talk about it's invisible. And then we've also been struggling more and more with the disputing that, even though it's not scientifically, and even in general public across any population, people, no matter where you live, people generally have been moving and trending toward, we don't know what we call the same thing, but my crops are getting flooded out. I can't plant, right? Like I don't know where to invest money overseas because the ratings are changing because it's a coastal area, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that are making it more concrete, but it's huge. The second one he says is that the way that we've been framing it doesn't work for human psychology. We're saying you need to make short-term sacrifices for long-term gains, right? It's really hard. And then the third one he says is that that again, he said it in a different way, but that we have to make sure that we overcome this creeping notion that is an uncertain fact, and we need to make sure that it is an uncontested space. And all those things, and I know I'm going off a little bit here, Naomi, but are why we think about democracy is helping us to understand ourselves and imagine the way we want to live. And it creates all kinds of on-ramps, and it's more concrete, right? And it's going to be essential to work at all those levels. You can pass a policy, you can pass an economic policy, but you can't have implementation guaranteed. And you want to make sure that the policies don't exacerbate disparities that are historic, because we forget to think about or include folks that can help bring not only perspective, but solutions. And so I think that's why democracy becomes a natural next step for us to work at all these levels, because that's what it requires.
Thank you. This is so rich. I'm going to jump around. So panelists, I'm going to deviate from our questions. I want to stick on this point about salience, right, Kara? It lacks salience. And that really came through in the findings, right? Among the non-climate funders, we saw that climate change is perceived as a distant, far off, it's sort of abstract, even as much as it's perceived as an urgent problem. So the role of philanthropy in this?
Well, I'll just say one other piece, and then I don't want to take up too much of the airwaves here. But I don't come from a climate philanthropy background. I've been at McKnight for almost 6 years, but I come from a democracy and civic engagement background, and I come from working in nonprofits and doing a lot of fundraising myself. And so, because of the way that the field evolved, and because we didn't have the moment we have now around collective. More people that are looking different, that are telling a richer story of who we are and how we got here. Like the whole demographics are shifting in this most beautiful way. It's messy, but we are figuring out who we are and who we want to be. And I believe in us, all of us, right? I believe in all of us. But this moment, we as philanthropy are so privileged, and we have so much access to information at every level. We have huge endowments, and we can talk about that too. We're
going to talk about that.
Huge opportunity and huge responsibility to do what we say for our grantees that we should do. We need to stop meeting by ourselves in little circles, and we need to actually figure out how to create this story together, because everybody is doing such hard work in the field, and we need them to be doing that work. Philanthropy as a sector has an opportunity for us to sit in rooms and help to create a language that speaks to who we will become. Because this 100 language problem that I made up, like that is our problem as much as it is anyone else's, because we've created these because for good reason, because we need to know how to make ourselves accountable to changes that we're invested in. But we have not had that conversation across. It's happening in small ways, but we feel like we have a lot of affinity groups in philanthropy in particular. And what would it look like if we were able to sort of think more creatively about that, like we do around race and democracy? Climate is that. It is a whole way of life for all of us.
So, and on that point, right, climate, just like race, is an intersectional issue that cuts across every issue that a funder could possibly be working on. And you all have made the point that there's a role for virtually every funder in finding a meaningful way to address climate that connects back to their mission. Let's talk for a minute about the role of philanthropy, and also how philanthropy can do this better, right? That's what you were starting to get to, Kara. And Katerina walked us through this data that leaders say that there's a really important role for philanthropy, and that philanthropy, to be more effective, needs to collaborate more, needs to focus on climate justice, and really needs to start, doing more advocacy work. I'm going to answer one question that came through, and then I'm going to turn to another question. Somebody put in the chat, a question about how funders tend to avoid advocacy as a strategy in general. And so there's a double challenge here, finding a new field for funders and also funding advocacy work that's much needed. And the person asked, how this plays out in our data. I would say, yes. So CEP put out a study a couple years ago about philanthropy and policy engagement. And one of the biggest barrier for foundations to engage in this work was building board support for policy. There was a great quote, our board is afraid of the word advocacy. But in studies that we at CEP have done over the past 2 years, we have seen a greater focus and more comfort for engaging in advocacy. And here too, right, a sense that in this data, over half of the climate funders have prioritized advocacy as core to their climate strategy, but a sense that even more of it is indeed needed. So let's stick with advocacy. This is a place, Taryn, where Unbound has done a lot of work, particularly in narrative change. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about advocacy work, about how you're thinking about narrative change work, particularly as it relates to how you are funding, frontline climate organizations?
Sure. I mean, before I do that, I just wanted to say something that's been really helpful for Unbound as we've entered the space of climate justice is working with the intermediary funds in the climate justice space, like the Solutions Project. And I know there are others. I mean, it's a way to learn, to know that your resources are going to great organizations, so I really encourage folks who are trying to get involved to do that. That's how, it's an incredible and easy first step to take. But Unbound does have a strong emphasis on transforming culture through narrative. And because we believe that narrative strategies complement advocacy, organizing, policy work, that the strategies strengthen each other, that the approaches need to be integrated. And I guess that our work in this area is really informed by the Pop Culture Collaborative, which is a collaborative that we co-founded. And part of their approach is creating a narrative system of coordinated stories where everyone is working toward and reinforcing the same North Star. And the North Star is a pluralist society and a just society where everyone is perceived to belong inherently, and they're treated that way. And it guides all the narrative systems that we support regardless of issues. So that's how we, when we started meeting organizations working at the intersection of climate and migrant justice, we saw that they already have a strong analysis of what the current climate migration narrative is and the shortcomings, and they're working together to determine what it should be. We've been lifting up the compelling narrative work that Colette has been doing. Our community is eager to connect with Taproot Earth, and there's just a lot of wisdom and energy in the area. We're excited to see what comes next. I guess, I think that you don't need to know the answers as a grant maker entering into the area. You can find trusted partners, invest in them, and let them show you the way.
This is great, right? You don't need all the answers. There's lots of on-ramps. There's a number of intermediaries that can connect to your work.
I'll take the bite around advocacy, and Colette, feel free to get ready. I think that what we're seeing all across the globe, right? I mean, most of us that are paying attention at all, even if you're paying attention to TV and what kind of shows are being produced, like you see massive migration, you see massive changes, you see challenges to the way that we thought life should be. You see contested space culturally, you see that playing out in economics, politically, et cetera. I think advocacy for a long time, and I'll use a kind of a Hari Han, social scientist Hari Han, she talks a lot about motivation and authority, right? You need to align motivation with authority. And I think what we're finding is there's a lot of motivation, and the aspect and way we think about authority is shifting. And I would say, to play with that a little bit, you have different authorizing environments than you did before. And they're again, I like messes. I think messes is where beauty and creativity emerge and abound, because it makes us wrestle with things. It kind of throws us off a little bit about what we thought we should be doing. So I actually think advocacy in certain, historically has been in a different context where it felt risky. I think what I hope that philanthropy is saying is that not speaking up with the authority that we have, to not be motivated to help be part of the solution, is actually, in some ways, it is a different type of risk than maybe historically traditional philanthropy has felt like advocacy was a risk. The risk of inaction is much bigger than the risk of action. And so I think that we as philanthropy, we as a nation are shifting. So I hope that we can continue to sort of move and shift with what I think is this moment that I don't want us to sort of lose, which historically social movements and moments, you don't get a lot of gain, but I don't think that there's any way that we can't keep pushing forward because all the pressures of the world and the planet are pushing us, that like what you started out with, like these natural disasters that are continuing to plague are affecting our bottom lines, are affecting our ratings, are affecting our investments, are affecting everything it's happening everywhere because it's whole scale. Yeah. And so I think advocacy in the old context, I hope, is seen as a powerful tool of being part of the solution instead of being content with the status quo and not wanting to take a risk because the risk of inaction is different. I hope that is what we're seeing, and we are gonna sustain that because I think that then the last thing I'll say is that when you were talking earlier, Taryn, I was thinking a lot about the difference between, for me, a really clear articulated North Star for everybody that maybe makes it more concrete. And then all of the things that we're talking about are different tactics, right? Or different target populations where we're beginning to speak to folks in a place where their interests align, whether it's medical or health or investments or et cetera, rural, urban, all those things are sort of tactical things. I think that we need to be really clear and help everybody understand what it means to actually move to a carbon neutral economy. Like, and that, even that term is going to be like distant for folks. But we have to get carbon out of our economy, and I think that we have to hold on to what we've learned here, to the global conversation, right? We have got to stop taking and exporting all of our dirty transportation and our extra, I mean, even clothing, how much overproduction we do and send. Like, we're polluting the planet on multiple levels by overproducing here and then shipping that elsewhere. It's not just carbon emissions, it's all the stuff that we export that actually exports, and it's like, we need to heal the planet, right? And so I think we just need to know it is actually about, in this case, about carbon. And we need to make that accessible. And then all the tactics and things like that are different.
Kara, sorry to interrupt you. We're going to come back in a couple minutes specifically to this question of carbon and the McKnight investment policy. But Colette, I want to hear from you here. We're talking about the role of philanthropy, how philanthropy can collaborate, can advocate, can use its voice and use its resources beyond its dollars. I want to hear your thoughts. You know, what do you think is the highest and best use of philanthropy in taking on climate change? What do you want to see funders doing more of, or to stop doing, or to do differently?
Yeah, I've got a lot of passionate feelings about this one. And I don't mean to insult, but I do mean to tell the truth about this. When you look at climate and environmental leaders across the globe, this is the #1 group of people who are being murdered because they're standing up to fight for their water, to fight for their air, to fight for their trees. We're not talking about police violence against people who, fight in the streets. We're talking about people who are standing up for air and water and trees. The #1 group of people who are putting their lives on the line are us. And to hear philanthropy be nervous about advocacy is a little insulting. We're out here fighting. And we need to know that the people who are standing with us are willing to be as courageous as we're being every day. I'm here in South Louisiana. We've got to go up against not just Louisiana companies, but the largest companies in the world, the most powerful companies in the world. We've had senators and representatives come down here and watch what it is to be followed by unmarked cars, government vehicles, and private security. This is a real situation. And if advocacy makes you nervous, then let me just say you haven't yet realized the reality of this climate crisis, which, by the way, was changed into the name of climate change so that everybody could feel more comfortable instead of hearing what was really happening, which is our planet is warming, the globe is warming, and everything is changing. But let's just say you don't want to get into advocacy. And clearly I have opinions about you not getting there, but let's just say you don't. This climate crisis requires solutions. And in places like South Louisiana and in communities that are Black and brown and poor and rural, there's nobody coming to help us. This is what we learned in Katrina. This is what we learned in Harvey. This is what we learned in Maria. So if you are not willing to do some advocacy around these laws, which, by the way, once they pass, rarely get implemented in places like the red block where I live, then invest in the solutions and the people who are coming up with the solutions. And that doesn't mean to give your money to ridiculous technologies that are going to continue to poison us and kill us, like carbon capture and blue hydrogen and all the rest of this stuff that we now have to fight because the oil and gas industry has created this reality that they're now trying to solve with their own technology and they're getting big money for. But instead, invest in the folks who are literally on the front lines coming up with wonderful solutions. You should see what the Vietnamese community is doing here to clean waterways, to make natural biomass, to build food for folks, because the grocery stores are out for months after a storm. You should see what these Black inventors are coming up with renewable energy around wind and training folks who worked in the oil and gas industry to now work in the wind industry, something that won't blow us up and won't accelerate the climate crisis, but can produce energy from clean and renewable sources in this area that we have. If you're not going to invest in the fight, then at least invest in the win. And the win here is going to be the solutions, and the solutions that come from the front line are what's going to be shared for the people, because the other technologies, whenever they get invested in, they don't make it down to us. So I would just say the role we could use from philanthropy is, I believe, a little bit of humility around what the answers to this crisis really is. It is not more of the same. It is not investing in the same industries. It is not investing in the same people who got us to this situation. It's doing something different. It's having the courage to unlearn and then learn the truth. And then it's shifting your mind and your reality around the ability to be able to follow leaders that you've never been taught to follow before. We're here, we're ready, we're doing the work. We've got no investment, nothing behind us, and we're still winning. We could use some support from our allies to scale these things up and out, not because we're trying to make money in the market, no shade, but because we're trying to survive. And those are the best moments of invention, and they're right here.
I think one thing that you said, Colette, is about the importance of advocacy. I want to encourage funders to think not about the risk of engaging in advocacy, but about the risk of not engaging in advocacy. I want to what we've been talking a lot about some of the on-ramps and ideas for funders to get involved. I want to really, I want to center in on this. Climate change is a big, messy, global, wicked problem. It can feel really overwhelming, especially for foundations that don't have staff with expertise, smaller foundations. Let's talk specifically about some of these on-ramps. I'm going to start with you, Taryn. What advice would you have for some of the first key steps for funders to take to address this issue, regardless of their core funding area?
I think talk to other, talk to people who've been doing the work, and bring people to bring stakeholders together on your issue area or in your community. There are so many ways in. Just make some general support grants, join collaboratives, just put some skin in the game and learn. Just say this is a necessary exploration. This is urgent. We don't know what the answers are, but we know that we need to do something, and just do it. I think
skin in the game.
Yeah.
So on that point, and to some of the questions that folks have put in through the chat, I'd also encourage you to check out the appendices in this report. There are pages of intermediaries, of research pieces, of some of the other philanthropy serving organizations in the space. And I think for folks who are looking to connect with others, who are looking to do this work in collaboration, there's going to be some great resources for you there. I think another way that funders can think about addressing climate change is in their endowments, right? Colette, you've been talking about that. Kara, this is, McKnight has been really public about its climate-related investing. Last year, you announced a big commitment to achieve net zero emissions by the year 2050 across your $3 billion endowment. And that, of course, includes divesting and also placing bets on alternatives to a carbon economy. There's a great piece about this, folks, in the Chronicle as well. Kara, talk to us about the benefits that you're experiencing, and advice, specifically advice that you have for funders that are thinking about climate-related investment practices.
Sure. So just to really briefly, if you are really interested in looking at it, go to our website. We believe really deeply in transparency. And so you'll find on our website under impact investing, a significant number of materials over the past decade, which is really when the program was envisioned back in 2013, 2014. So I just want to say that because I'm not going to talk about that a lot. But what I will say, we have a lot of lessons learned. One is that when we started out, we didn't start with a blunt force trauma, like let's just divest, because we didn't know what we were doing. And at the end of the day, we all live in the tension of my job is paid for through traditional markets. Like I feed my family working at a foundation that is holding the complexity of an endowment that relies on markets and market forces. And we also know that those market forces can be some of the most damaging, to the point that Colette, you mentioned before. So we live in that complexity, and we all have to make a choice if we can work within that context, but I just want to name it. So, but what we did was to say, okay, so if your endowment, which is the largest money, can be made to be more aligned with your values, how do you do that in a way that you build confidence and skill over time? And so what we started to do was we started with a few questions, and we really were explicit about learning. And so now we have about $500 million of our endowment aligned. And we did make a commitment to, hopefully before 2050, to be able to actually continue to move toward a carbon neutral, a zero carbon endowment. But that's going to happen slowly because these investments are long term. So like you can't start now and think you're going to clean it up in 10 years. So I think you just have to be patient, focus on something, learn. There's a huge amount of resource out there, and happy to talk with folks, and I think happy to share networks and all that kind of stuff. So but it can be daunting.
Thanks for being open to that, Kara. And folks, I encourage you to check out the resources in the chat. We have 5 minutes left. I am, and there's so much more to talk about. For a moment we're going to talk about climate anxiety. Many of us are experiencing it. The recent Supreme Court decision just made it that much harder for the EPA and that much more challenging to do this work here in the US. I wonder if Colette, let's start with you. Will you share an example of something that's giving you hope right now, of maybe a positive outcome that you contributed to let's hear it. And then over to you, Kara.
Yeah, well, I started doing this work in the middle of disaster. It can be depleting, all of the things, right? And if you really recognize the gravity of the climate crisis, you will have moments of sadness, because no matter what we do, we will lose a lot, even if we win, including my community. And that's something I have to think about and deal with every day. But in July, we held a Climate Justice and Joy gathering in Baton Rouge, where we had folks from across the Gulf, Puerto Rico, across the nation come in, over 1,000 people, come in to celebrate the things that we are fighting for, to celebrate family and love and food and tradition and the things that make us get up every day and move every day. We practice moving together by learning the political culture of bomba dance as a resistance dance, learning Cajun line dancing, and moving together, because we have forgotten how to do that as a humanity, right? We've forgotten that we're actually brothers and sisters, and we should be doing this together. And the festival had vendors, all Black vendors and local vendors, serving using a zero waste method. So we didn't have waste coming from our food. We had water stations and cooling stations to show that we don't have to use single-use plastic bottles. We don't have to use styrofoam for food. We're just showing people what's possible, and we're doing it with joy and love. We started with Indigenous and African drumming, and we ended with the words of the tribe whose land we were on. And it was a beautiful, beautiful day where folks left feeling like we could actually win. And it's that kind of mind shift and power change that we need. We've seen a lot of money, a lot of people, a lot of media come to this region. But what we haven't seen is what it takes to bring people to their own power and get them to use that power collectively. We had everyone. We had folks from the community, but we even had the private sector. We had a solar demonstrator called Posigen there. They reached out and said, we heard y'all are moving again. You know, since COVID, we hadn't been out in the world. And we said, come join us, show people what solar can do and what some of what the possibilities are and what some of the changes are. So we're feeling really good. We need everybody, and we're feeling really good.
Sharing. Yeah, I love it. Kara, what's giving you hope? What's something? Yeah.
Well, because we haven't, you know, we just met today, Colette. I'm so happy that you mentioned Posigen, because I think that there are ways for us to think on multiple levels around change. And so, you know, we want demonstration projects, so it's not so esoteric and abstract. And I want to say that after Hurricane Ida ripped through southern Louisiana, you know, the communities you're talking about didn't have power, no air conditioning, no fans, no refrigerators, no lights, right? Nothing that would help even orient you in the midst of disaster. And so what we did was we actually invested in Posigen in New Orleans to deploy 12 solar power stations with partners. And so it is just like this beautiful moment when our investment team and our foundation, our board invested in a company that is deeply committed to community and is there dancing with you in the streets. And we're going to get to scale like 300 solar powered battery homes in the area. So it's just a delight to see these when we didn't plan it, and that it's possible to do micro and macro, and for those to converge in this powerful, practical way.
This is great. Thank you for, you know, not just a call to action, but examples of contributing to success and what this can look like. We have like 1 minute left, you all. So many good questions. We're almost out of time. Taryn, I'm going to ask you to close us out. What do you hope funders take away from today's discussion?
That we have to work together, and that we have to use imagination and imagine a future where we're slowing climate change, we're adapting to climate change, and it's a better future. I mean, I'm really inspired by a recent conversation I heard Krista Tippett and Adrienne Marie Brown having, really reflects how I'm feeling. And they said, what a time to be alive. We're in a total paradigm shift. We're tasked with standing before these existential, potentially transformative juncture for our species. And the most exciting thing right now is that we're aware. We're in a place where we can create so much history and so much change. Everything is falling apart, but also new things are possible. We're in a time of new suns. We're in a time of new suns. We have the privilege to be part of that.
The time of new suns. Wow. Kara, Colette, thank you all so much for a great conversation. I really hope that this discussion and these resources are going to spur attendees and foundation staff and boards to really discuss climate change and its implication across all of their work. I hope that this is a resource for all of you to engage differently or to begin to engage in this work. Be in touch with us at CEP if you have any questions. Thank you again to our awesome panelists. Have a great day, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.
And with that, I'll close this out. Thank you all for being on this panel and also for participating today. For those who have joined us on Zoom, you'll be receiving a survey in your inbox, if you haven't already, asking for feedback on this event so we can be continually improving our program offerings. Please do take 2 minutes to fill it out. It really helps us. Thank you again, and farewell until next time.